All right, awesome. Thank you for making it out. Anyone play a little game called God of War? Ah! How many awards we got coming in? Like countless awards. Game of the Year and everything else has been rolling in, and it's our honor and privilege to say, you know, obviously God of War was built with Maya, and we're super excited to share how some of that got done. And Axel is roughly about 4 to 5 times smarter than me, so I'm going to get off stage and let him do that. So without further ado, thanks again, Axel.
All right, thank you. Alrighty, so thanks for showing up, everyone. We got a big crowd here, which is awesome. I'm going to basically go through and talk about a lot of the animation tools and techniques that we developed for this game. But first, let's play a little trailer here.
On the day you were born, I made 2 knives, mixing metals from my home and from this land. One for myself, and when you were ready, one for you. Today is that day.
So I'm a man now. Like you?
No, we are not men. We are more than that. The responsibility is far greater. And you must be better than me. Understand? Stay calm, boy! Say it.
You will be better.
The power of this weapon, any weapon, comes from here. But only when tempered by this. By the discipline, the self-control of the one who wields it. That is where the true strength of a warrior lies.
The boy's true nature, your true nature, fights within him.
Hang on!
Think I'm afraid of you! You're nothing to me!
Boy,
Nothing!
Don't make the same mistake. Have faith in him.
I can hold on!
I know the truth isn't simple, but nothing is when it involves your child.
We must be better. You must never forget that.
Alrighty, so to follow the note of being better here, we had to do a lot of new stuff for this game. Basically, we had project goals, at least these are the goals that spoke to my group, is higher fidelity characters, greater emotional impact, and more relatable characters. So the impact on rigging and animation is that we had to develop new workflows, rig systems for maintaining animation performance. We developed fax-based facial rigs that are using film-like quality blend-shaped data sets, and introducing post-based deformation to get better deformation across Kratos' body, as well as control the armor in a sophisticated way. Linear skinning was not going to be the, at least with the way we were approaching it, not going to be the silver bullet. So, as well as we brought in a huge amount of motion capture into this project that was not there in previous games. So before I get into the kind of more technical details about the various tools we created, I just want to do a little bit of specs of coming from PS3 to PS4. So old PS3, Kratos was very comic book proportions. He was 9 heads tall. If we took his model out and put it to real world scale, he was 7'6". All of this fit the old God of War style and gameplay. You can see some kind of the specs on the rigs there. Moving into PS4 though, we went with realistic proportions, 8 heads tall, about 6'4". We also cast our actors to be close to the character scale. So now that we're speaking real world coordinate system units, you can talk with the motion capture team much better. There's no scale conversions happening. And it just makes a single language for coordinates work out a lot better. Yeah, more natural transfer of the motion capture data. And probably most people are now rigging or binding, at least in A pose. So this was something, a greater change here, whereas we used to do T pose binding, but that leads to high armpits when arms drop. If you don't have a metric for what to set your A pose at, the 60 degrees is the limit of the humerus joint before your clavicle takes over. So if you don't let your clavicle move, you really can't get that humerus too much further. It also opens up an area in the armpit to let the normals not crisscross so that you don't get the classic kind of splotchy, dark-skinned area under armpits when game characters lift their arms typically. So having a little bit of metric for that just makes it so you're not kind of guessing, oh, like this, like that. No, go to 60, you're good. Here's just a little image of old Kratos versus new Kratos. This would be real-world scale height. If I bring them to the same basic height, you can start seeing some of these proportional differences a little more clearly. You know, small head, big hands, very long legs. This would present some issue with motion capture data, trying to transfer onto something that's not as realistic in proportion. And then this image just shows kind of the polygonal density we're coming from on PS3 to PS4. So a lot more resolution being put into the face to capture all this blend shape data. All right, so let's get into the meat of this talk here, the animation tools and tech of God of War. So we did animation retargeting using Human IK within Maya. They brought the Human IK over from Motion Builder into Maya, and I wrote a tool to wrap around that, allowing us to transfer animation. I also developed a system. Basically, our old rigs were one skeleton, one rig, somewhat intertwined. We needed to separate this out so that we could have greater performance within Maya. So I can load in different levels of skeleton detail on the fly. We also introduced Motion Builder, and getting Motion Builder and Maya to play nice together was a little bit of a challenge, but we feel like we came up with a pretty solid solution. And then the facial rigging, as I've mentioned, the FACS-based, which stands for Facial Action Coding System. Probably some of you are familiar. That was a whole new thing for God of War. And then on top of it, we add in the pose-based deformation. So let's start with animation retargeting. There's various methods out there. I mean, the simplest of them is you just swap your reference inside Maya, point it to a new file, and hope all is well. But it really does not take into account character scale. So if you have any sort of differing size character, you're going to be scaling up your translation values and trying to basically rectify what's going on there. You can write some custom tools around constraining one rig to another rig using offsets and then start tuning these offsets to get a decent retarget. But it's a lot of work and may not lead to as nice of results as the Human IK solver can do. Human IK also gives you access to additional retargeting parameters. If a character absolutely needs to reach a cup or some object, you can have access to that stuff and basically using full body IK, force your end effector to hit that pose. So there's a lot more power in the Human IK. So we went with the Human IK in Maya initially as our retargeting. Human IK does have a custom rig option, but we've got additional things like weapons to take care of, various float channels of data that we need to also retarget. So kind of using that as a little bit of inspiration, we came up with our own skeleton to rig constraining plus Human IK. So basically we generate a Human IK skeleton, and then I have a config sheet in Python that basically says, hey, match this guy up to this guy, constrain this way, and things lock together that way. So I'm going to play a little video of this animation retargeting tool that we have. So Kratos is chopping the guy in the back of the leg there. So that's a Dark One character, one of those guys that float around and come at you with their spears. So if I wanted to, let's say, swap Kratos for the Sun and maybe move a Draugr into place of the Dark One, I can use this animation retargeter. It gives us access to the projects and the various groupings of characters. We can search for various animations. Works in multiple formats. Works in a method where you can do a one-step retarget and then adjust parameters if you need to, or you can just go retarget and bake. Lots of times the animators just wanted to one-step this thing. It's also batchable if you need it to be. So right now, bringing in the Sun character, aligning things up, generating skeletons, constraining, characterizing. And now we have set up our retarget. So it handles multiple characters. We just got 2 in the scene now, but you could do, whatever, however many you need. And you might see that little HIK icon on the ground there. That was just a way to get at the attributes of the human IK easily for an animator to adjust those parameters if they so desire. You can play around with things like foot spacing, all sorts of different parameters. And then we can just bake this thing down. It's basically going to copy the animation over onto the retargeted character and then dump out the source stuff. You'll notice weapons get reattached. So we have a weapon system that switches different coordinate spaces. So it'll do that. It'll move weapons over into different characters' hands. Also, if this was a hand-keyed animation and you didn't want keys on every single frame, the bake process has an option to basically sample per channel the key ticks, so you get exactly, or basically the same hand-authored animation feel when you retarget. So the retarget doesn't mean it's a baked out per frame animation. So if the animator feels like they want to go back and then enhance the animation, they're not maybe making an animation layer, although that's a totally valid, great way to go. Yeah, just a little side benefit I thought was neat. So that's mostly what we did for animation retargeting. Once I get it to motion capture, we have some other ways of doing retargets, but this was kind of our first stop for retargeting, and this ended up being used way more than I ever thought it would. So sometimes you put stuff out there and then you don't know where it goes, but I'd walk around the studio and I'd like, oh, this guy's retargeting something. Oh, he's retargeting something. So that's kind of cool. Let's move on now to rig granularity. So I mentioned splitting up the rig and the skeleton. Separating out these two is very important. Basically, creating no historical dependence from the rig to the skeleton allows the skeleton to be its own reference file. So if you're using Maya referencing to bring in your character rigs, now I'm using 2 references, really more than that, but essentially I have my rig and I have my skeleton, and I can connect them together, and then I can swap out the reference if I need. So I call these rig parts. So the face rig might be a rig part, or is a rig part on our more cinematic characters. We have cloth rigs to deal with basically aiding the position of cloth objects that will then get simulated in the engine. And then we have our decapitation rigs. So if you've ever put an enemy down in a God of War game, you know it's done with a flare. So we have these decap rigs that then can attach into our core rig and basically start manipulating that rig. So if a character is getting split down the center and his arms and clavicles are going to separate out, we can generate a rig that basically allows that rig to drive the core rig and pull the arms apart. And then sometimes you actually just want the arms to go flying off, and then we can space switch into that mode if we need. This is all being done with network nodes inside Maya using message connections. This was an idea presented in, I believe it was a GDC in 2009 by David Hunt from Bungie. He called it semantic traversal. Essentially what this is that you're marking up every rig component or object in your scene on a network node. And then you write your tools around accessing these network nodes. That way your tools aren't littered with name checking, what's this object, is it parented to this? Scripts get really kind of nasty that way. This allows it to be, go to the network node, what's on it, match up the names, connect the two together, you're done. So the script is much more concise and a little bit more straightforward that way. So I highly recommend that. You can probably dig up that old talk. I guess we're 10 years now later, but it was still a great idea, and I think a lot of studios are using it. So here's just a little image showing that skeleton rig separation and our character definition UI tool. So if we auto-generate all the data on these network nodes when we build the rigs, but sometimes there's a little one-off thing you have to add or maybe noodle it, so this tool allows us to get at the network nodes and redefine things or change things up as needed. And then this would just be a node editor view where basically you have the core rig, skeleton mesh, face rig, cloth rig. There could be the decap rig in there. And then these are the various network node components. Kind of like their own little mini hierarchies. We started out with a data root node for a character, and then that goes down into subsection data nodes that hold the information on our rigs. And here's just another view of that. Lots of listed out things, but I don't have to write a script that's calling out back 1, back 2, back 3. It's just network node, what's on you, what added attributes, what user-defined stuff is there, and then match them up. And then here's just a quick little image of the granularity of just the skeleton mesh portion. So we can have just pure skeleton, parted mesh, just meshes parented to skeleton bones. That's derived from skinning data, so we just skin the model and then we run the tool and it'll chop the mesh up. Or you can go into the actual linear skinning, or you couldn't really tell in this video, but the full-on body deformation with PSD on the right. And the tool on our right is what we call our character manager. It allows us to bring in assets, load the various rig bits, swap out the mesh level of detail, as well as give some access to the display layers, because you get these big scenes with tons of characters in them. I found myself personally hunting through the display layers trying to find stuff. So I like having this here. It gives me an easy way to know this is the stuff related to this character, and I can easily turn things off and set them to various reference modes or what have you. Now with my 2019, I need to add the play blasting box in there. So that's a kind of high-level overview of the rig granularity. Do check out the David Hunt's talk if you can find it. I think he also did one a few years ago that touches on some of the same stuff. Let's turn now to motion capture. So motion capture, we all know what it is. We've all seen, hundreds of DVDs and various game breakdowns where they're showing everyone in their suits and they're, doing the mocap. But this was a new thing to us. Like, we all knew what it was, but the previous games were completely hand-keyed. There was a little bit of mocap here and there for various cinematic things. They dabbled in it, but it was really a hand-keyed game, which kind of fit the old style. But now in this kind of new modern context, we had so much animation data to produce at such a high fidelity that we had to introduce motion capture. So how are we going to do this? We could use Maya. Well, the animation team is very familiar with Maya, quite comfortable. There are some new human IK tools in Maya, as you saw with the animation retargeter. So yeah, maybe an option. But there's a few people, especially our camera or director of cinematography, or I hope I'm not getting his title wrong, Dori Arazi. He really needed to do real-time camera work, as well as Motion Builder runs very fast with bipedal characters, and it's got extremely powerful nonlinear editing tools. So while we have, as you may know, a one-shot camera, basically it's a single camera that follows you the entire time. We don't really cut back and forth between close-ups, wide shots. It's all one camera. There's still a lot of editing. There's still multiple takes. So the animators have to do a lot of work to make that feel seamless like it was all shot in one single take. Obviously, you can't shoot the entire game on one shot, one stage, one day. Maybe someone will do it, but I don't think a game of this scale would lend itself well to that. We brought in the motion builder. So we were presented with the challenge, okay, how do we get our data out of motion builder into Maya? Well, we could bake down every frame and then bring it into Maya and set up some sort of constraint thing, or maybe use the animation retargeter and then get a bake out in Maya and wait for that to happen. But we were inspired by the one-click solution that Motion Builder and Maya ship with. Basically, if you have matching names in both apps, it'll just do an FBX export out of Motion Builder and then just straight import onto those exact same names in Maya, which is a fairly fast process. Baking in Motion Builder tends to go fairly quick, faster than Maya was running. So we didn't want to have to do another bake step inside Maya. So what we did is we created a transfer rig. This is a rig that matches our Maya coordinates one-to-one. Basically, we have a script inside Motion Builder or a tool that aligns this transfer rig to any character that needs to be transferred, plots to that transfer rig, and then that transfer rig gets updated with the namespace, does its FBX export, and basically, due to how FBX integration works in Maya, just basically puts that animation right back onto our Maya rigs that are completely different than the Motion Builder side rig. So I have a little video of that. Well, before I got the video here, this just shows on the right the coordinate spaces of the transfer rig. So it's not even a rig, it's a transfer space. It's just to hold the proper values, so the red boxes are offsets and the white boxes are the things that are going to actually receive the keyframe data or the baked data. So we call this tool Motion Builder to Maya. A talented tech artist at our work, Mark Wilhite, wrote this thing up. It's since had some more features added to it. But essentially we got our Sun and our Kratos rig over in Maya, and we got some Motion Builder data. I believe this clip was taken from when the Sun pulls Kratos out of the Alfheim light. So here we can just queue up an association. It knows what's in Maya, knows what's in Motion Builder. We essentially just create a queue. You can see that transfer rig snap into the skeleton. And then here comes the import animation data. And there you go. So this is a little bit of an older clip there, but this tool was used extensively throughout production. It's really become kind of the cornerstone of getting the two apps to play nice. So that was a huge win, getting that working. So I highly recommend, if you're going to take on Motion Builder into your pipeline, maybe give it a try. I think it's a good approach. And if you think you have something fancier, hit me up on LinkedIn or whatever, and I'd be happy to hear it. So let's turn over here to facial rigging now. So I just start with this slide here. This Duchenne guy, back in the 1800s, he was studying expressions of the human face. And basically he would take electrified probes to insane asylum patients. He wanted to find out what muscles in the face did what. So he was trying to isolate muscle movements. And he would basically electrocute people to get them to hit various facial movements and study what an isolated muscle movement looks like on a face, because it can be hard to isolate these muscle movements. Now, supposedly I was reading that this guy, you can see kind of a second row down, a little bit on the top row. Supposedly he didn't feel any pain in his face under electrocution, but still the images are a little bit horrifying, But anyway, all in the pursuit of what makes the face work, right? So then, whatever, 100 years later, more, I don't have exact figures, This guy, Dr. Paul Ekman and Wallace Friesen, come along, and they publish this facial action coding system document. He was a psychologist. He was coming at this more from the angle of, obviously CG and, games weren't quite the deal they are now. But yeah, he basically wanted to kind of be able to tell people's emotional states, see if someone's lying or not. So he looked into the various isolated muscle movements as well. I don't think he got into shocking people, but maybe he's got his own secrets. Basically, he believes that our emotions are discrete, measurable, and physiologically distinct and universal. So I question this a little bit, but I think in general it's true that across cultures, our faces tend to just auto kind of take on our emotional state. And there's really not a great variance in that. You're not going to find, unless someone knows of a culture, but I don't think you're going to find a culture that scowls a lot when they're happy to see you. Raising your brows, opening your eyes wide, smiling, these are kind of upward actions, and they relate to your mental state. And I think they're not too separate, how you feel and the way you use your face, the up feeling or frowning, the down kind of feeling, I think there's something to be said for that. So we wanted to use this system. The visual effects world has been using FACS for quite a while, building out 3,000 blend shape rigs with isolated facial movements and then all the corrections that go around with that or come with that. Games, we're starting to get into that more. So we partnered up with Sony Visual Arts Services Group, and they did our scan acquisition. And so basically we'll find someone who's talented at moving their face. Basically they can isolate muscle movements in their face, which is very hard to do. I've found that over a number of these FACS auditions, probably 1 out of 10 people has about 80% facial control across all their muscles. So it's very normal that you can't do everything. Maybe Jim Carrey is, 95%, I don't know. I like to think I'm okay, but there's certain areas I can't hit as well. So doing a FACS audition before you get that guy in the scan chair and finding out that half his face is not working or not going to provide you data, this stuff's costly. So you want to make sure you got a good source material, if you will. Not that I want to call a person a source material, but it's what it is, right? And then there's the whole process of remeshing. So this is basically taking your game topology and attaching it to the scan data in a proper fashion. Scan data is many millions point clouds of data stitched together into polygons, totally unusable as is. You never rig or skin, or there would be no continuity of vertex IDs between these scans. So you got to get your mesh onto the scan in a registered fashion. You also have to stabilize scans. So VSG has developed these systems, and we took advantage of that. Although we did build a lot of our blend shape sets in-house, which I think is a little bit not normal, which there were benefits in that I learned how deep that rabbit hole is. And now I can speak the language with like the Visual Arts Services Group and other people that are FACS oriented. But it's a ton of work, so I don't necessarily recommend anyone just go this route alone, unless you've got a lot of time or are very dedicated or extremely bright. Even so, it's just a lot of work. I highly suggest letting an outside vendor at least assist you, but possibly do the whole blend shape rig. Because as a game TD, we have the burden of then transferring that into the game engine. Are we decomposing our skinning down to joints? Are we going to try to put blend shapes into the engine? Oftentimes, programmers, that doesn't really jive with the way an engine's built necessarily, or it'll have negative impacts on speed. So we have enough as it is trying to get a face rig into the game. Building them out yourself can add another layer of complexity. But that being said, I did it. So here's our Fax Manager tool. This is basically just a tool that associates or puts models in various folders, and then I can rebuild the rig as needed. So if a particular shape isn't playing well, we go update that shape. We can rebuild the rig as needed, or we can do a fax transfer using facial measurements across various key components of a face, and then port this data over onto another character. So it takes about, probably from scan to blend shape rig delivery, you're looking at probably 3 months, if not more. That's a lot of time to wait for a blend shape rig. You got a cast of characters. Is it really practical to do that? Not really. So you need a way of transferring this data. Unless you got a lot of time and resources and money, we didn't have a lot of time. So transferring your data is also very important. This is what the scan rack looks like down at VASG. So it's photogrammetry. There's this Sonny Sulik, the boy, in his chair. Basically, these snap, just like a regular camera, takes a bunch of pictures from all sorts of angles, and then software stitches this all together into a 3D point cloud mesh. Here's Jeremy Davies, our Balder actor. These are just 3 scans on the bottom and then the remeshed versions up top. So we got our nose wrinkling action on the left, corner puller zygomatic muscle on the right, or in the middle, and then essentially the combination of these two on the right. And if anyone's played around with blend shapes a bit, they probably know that blend shapes don't really blend. They more add, or they do add. But I guess add shapes isn't really that nice a word, or not so catchy. So additive nature is, both of these actions have a bit of effect on the cheek. If we have 2 cheek poses coming together, you could get an over additive effect where the cheeks are basically lifting up in an unnatural way. So that's where this third pose comes in. It's a correction driven by the first 2. So as the first 2 dial on, we basically simply just multiply the 2 together, and we drive our correction that way. This is what leads these things to be 3,000 shapes like in the film world, or in our case, we hit about 800 shapes on God of War. So you have your core fax muscles. There's not 800 muscles in your face. There's about 40 to 50 key muscles. But then when you start combining them with the additive nature of a blend shape, this dictates that you start creating scans and fixes for every combination or scenario. Now, to be honest, we don't create every combination or scenario. That would just be almost an endless effort. So things get animated, they get solved. As you hit odd spots, you go back and you clean some of that stuff up. Now, of course, you do know some of these are going to get hit, so you do come out of the gate with a certain set. But yeah, tons of work in this kind of stuff. Highly recommend finding a solid outsourced partner to take on a lot of this work. I showed this slide because this is the registration UV set, just vertex colors that we used. And I showed the UV set because it's good to have a standard base ground truth to transfer stuff. So if I wanted to start, de-resing this face mesh or changing up the topology flow for whatever reason to capture more wrinkles in certain areas, I can do that as long as what I'm editing came from the same UV set. You can use mesh transfer attributes with the UV option and just basically copy all your blend shapes over onto new topologies. So UV sets, we had a UV set for the head and we had a UV set for the body. And those were project standard. Even if we took some issue with the UV sets later on, well, it was locked in. This is what we got. This is what we're using. I'll also just point out that you need to keep these various colored regions registered across all your different blend shapes. Because if you go to a smile blend shape, and let's say the little green line around the edge of the lips shifts up or down a little bit, or the nasolabial fold shifts around, you'll get this effect we call swimming, where the texture starts sliding across the surface in an unnatural way. So things need to be registered across all of these scans. which is not the easiest thing to do, which once again, why relying on someone like the Visual Arts Service or a place like the Visual Arts Services group is very helpful. I did write some of my own tools, but they had far more time to work on it and they had a better solution, so I went with that. Here's a little video of putting some of this stuff together of Sonny here. So I'm just asking him to bare his teeth, kind of do some random stuff. We don't have any wrinkle maps on the face at this point, but starting to get a fairly good continuity between the two. Smiling can be kind of difficult to get right sometimes. So we're starting to get a fleshier feel out of the face here, which spoke well to the route we were taking. We had cubic motion solve our face data. VASG did some early solves as well. I'm not exactly sure what this was solved with. Could have been either. And then in regards to transferring this stuff, this is a little bit earlier on where our region map wasn't quite as detailed as it had become in that earlier slide. But we started looking at, okay, can we put this on our ogre character? Well, if we register stuff right, we should get something out of it. But obviously this ogre has a far larger philtrum area between the nose and the lip, as well as the head just being generally larger overall, and various other feature differences that are fairly obvious. So we developed a system by which we can mult up areas, multiply down the contribution of other areas. I ended up splitting this tool into multi-axis, so we'd take every blend shape, pull out the X component, pull out the Y component, pull out the Z component, and scale those differently. So a large jaw, you might need a little bit more Z-axis, but if the head's kind of thin, or the head's kind of scrunched, you don't want as much Y contribution, that kind of thing. You also get the benefit that when you move facial animation data onto creatures, we don't have that very instinctual connection of reading another person's face. So you just skirt the uncanny valley pretty much. It doesn't hit you in this way of like, oh God, that looks a little odd. Maybe it does look a little odd because we pushed a little far here. So as you know, we have a big snake in our game. So this was early on. We were like, all right, snakes. Could a snake emote like this? Jormungandr in the game didn't actually get this blend shape transfer. We did a custom one-off face rig for him. But you gotta try, right? You gotta see what you could possibly do. See where stuff breaks, right? If you don't know where it breaks, you haven't gone far enough. A big component to this is then getting wrinkles and blood flow into the face. The mesh just is not dense enough to capture all this stuff, and then blood flow you just wouldn't capture anyways. So, if you squeeze your knuckles or articulate your face and look in the mirror, you'll see that blood gets pushed out of areas. Areas in the face turn white, a lighter color. Other areas turn a little bit more red. While this maybe isn't like overtly obvious, it does have an impact on how the face looks under animation. So we created a wrinkle and blood flow system. We're basically using 6 different maps, 3 wrinkle maps and 3 blood flow maps. We can access 27 different regions. So you could figure out, we can play around with what regions we want to have activated, paint those areas in, and then we can get wrinkles within those areas. I created this in shader effects. Shader effects was a really awesome way to just visually start seeing if my math was correct. You know, if I'm pre-multiplying the right stuff, if I'm getting a black edge around my region. Basically, Shader Effects gives me a live update. I can create the nodes in there, and then I just handed it off to an engine programmer, and he did a really slick thing where he was able to bake down my regions into 4 channels, accessible with like an alpha channel using some ID system. It was pretty slick. So yeah, props to him. Matt Arrington did that. Right now, the wrinkle system is a linear blend with base normal. Basically, it's cutting out an area of the face and inserting a new wrinkle map within that region. With full replacement at 100% activation. I believe some places are doing some additive normals at this time, so I'm going to be looking into doing that because I think the node network maybe got a little heavier than it needed to be. So if we look at it, there's 3 different wrinkle maps that are storing different wrinkle regions, and there is a priority here where map 1 will ride on top of map 2, which will ride on top of map 3. So you want to kind of be aware of that. But this was the Shader Effects node network. It looks worse than it is. Just like any math formula or something, as you start breaking down to the components, it's really not as daunting as the whole thing in your face at once. No pun intended. So here's just a very early wrinkle map test. So at portions of the video, I'll pause it and turn off the wrinkles. So turn the wrinkles off, you lose them out of the chin, the nose area, brow. This view shows the regions firing off and on. This was all driven by joint positions on the face using the pose space deformer, which I'll talk about in a second here. But basically, as joints in regions of the face take on particular configurations, it tells the system to dial in this wrinkle map region at this location. So crow's feet, so having a wrinkle map system is very important to capturing all that tertiary detail. And if you just want to experiment with it, Shader Effects allows you to do a lot of what would require a shader writing skill set. You can do it on your own with just simple math nodes. All right, let's hit the last big topic here, pose space deformation. So what is pose space deformation? Well, there's a white paper that first outlined it, but I guess you could say that it could be any sort of pose correction. But in our case, it was a technique by which a deformer is used to augment or correct the deformation of another deformer driven by the pose or object. So in our case, it's vertex offsets, basically blend shape targets, driven pre-skinning by an array of angle calculations on primary joints of the body. Essentially what these become is little blend shapes that basically activate muscle areas and fix-ups. If you saw this run without the character in actual skeletal animation, you would just see various areas on the body shifting and compressing and bulging in unnatural ways. It probably wouldn't look very cool. Or maybe it looks cool, but it wouldn't look like anything reasonable. But then that activated at the proper time with skinning then taking over, it looks correct in context. Pose-space deformation is, you can kind of think of driving these things like a set-driven key. So if you've ever played around in Maya with a set-driven key where I have some value or input value, and then with an animation curve I can define my output value, basically your XY axis. So it's kind of like that, except instead of a single inputting value, you have an n-dimensional array of drivers, and it's the state of all these values at any one time that define where a pose is and where you are in the pose space. So if you've ever tried to drive corrections on a shoulder with your Euler angles, your XYZ, well, Euler angles are prone to, well, not prone, they will always gimbal lock somewhere. So highly mobile areas like the shoulder, most complex joint in the human body, or the hip, which is also a multi-axis, will eventually gimbal, and you could get a correction firing off at a very odd pose. I remember when I was first getting into rigging, spending a couple long nights just fighting that because I didn't understand Oilers and gimbal, and I was just banging my head against it. Now later on, it's like, yeah, okay, I get it. So we need some other way to drive these types of three-axis articulating joints. So post-space deformation uses what's called radial basis functions. This is kind of a fancy way, a lot of math tends to sound, well, to me, being kind of a hobbyist mathematician at this point, and that's a stretch. They sound worse than they are. So radial, this is really just the distance. Distance is the input to the function. So this is very much like a set-driven key, just as I approach a pose, how am I blending into it? Am I blending in linearly with a Gaussian, quadratic blend? All these radial basis functions are basically working together behind the scenes to blend all your different poses together. When I refer to RBF here, I'm going to be talking about moving joints and transforms around. When I talk about PSD, I'm talking about moving vertices, basically the little blend-shaped offsets I was talking about. But essentially, they're both, or not essentially, they are both RBF systems. RBF is the basis of the post-space deformation system. It's just the classic definition of post-space deformation usually relates to doing some sort of vertex change on a model. So I just use RBF to say I'm talking about moving joints or changing a color on an object or whatever it may be. So how did we use PSD on God of War? We did this for muscle corrections for Kratos and Baldur. Baldur being our main antagonist, he was shirtless the entire time, so he needed some sort of fix-ups, and Kratos, obviously our main hero, a fairly muscular dude, probably 250 pounds or so, and his body will show these linear skinning problems a lot more than thinner characters or fully clothed characters will. So we needed a way to make that feel grounded and more realistic. Now you may not overtly notice it, but if it's not there, it just doesn't quite have the same grounded feel of reality or hyper-reality in this case. Also, PSD can kind of be a get-out-of-jail-free card. You got your skinning all set up, now you need your mesh to do something quite odd, little one-off thing. It's like, oh, do I start borrowing weights from my skinning, putting them on other joints, redoing stuff? Or do I just say, hey, slap a blend shape on that thing and be done with it? So it has that benefit too. And then RBF, armor. So all the armor was skinned, not blend shapes. It would become highly impractical to do that with blend shapes across the large amount of armor sets. So if any of you have gotten a decent ways into the game, there's quite a bit of armor pieces you can swap in and out. So I needed a way to drive all this stuff without just, bringing myself to insanity or just, bringing, further delays or bringing a delay to, my deliveries. So armor deformation using RBF PSD on the body. We also used RBF to control the gross deformation of Freya's hair to basically keep it out of collision objects. So as she would tilt her head left, right, I would reconfigure where the base cloth patches would be, and then the solver takes over and kind of smooths it all out. That way you don't get hair stuck in between collisions trying to jitter around and do odd, ugly things. I'd like to give credit to Michael Comet, who outlined this method a long time ago, and he provided his PSD source code for people to experiment with. So we looked at it for some inspiration. There are a few mathematical problems in there, but still much props to him for being so willing to let the community learn from his hard work. Pose space deformation, as I was talking about the driver being n-dimensional or having any number, you basically can create a table of data, whatever that may be, whether it's 5 different angle measurements on a shoulder, a set of colors, all the positions of people in the room, whatever you want. You can start associating these things, you can start mixing them, and it's the value state at any one time that becomes a point in space. So if you look at it in 2 dimensions, it's very easy to see it. Well, before I get to that slide, I'll just say that pulling distances is fairly simple. Pythagorean theorem, 2D, extends to 3D. You just add the extra component, square it up, and sum it, takes the square root. That goes to infinity, so you can just keep adding dimensions. And that's essentially what this is doing, is it's measuring poses in n-dimensional space. So you stop being able to really visualize it at 3 dimensions. But if you just take that knowledge of knowing that, oh, I can see this in 3 dimensions, going to 4, 5 isn't such a stretch. Just knowing that the distance calculation is really the same stuff. It's just more dimensions that actually exist in our real world. So here, if we look at it as a very simple axis, y, x-axis driver relationship, we got our various poses at various xy coordinates. Those are the little blue dots. The green locator would be where we're currently at, whatever current values we have. So right now I'd probably be picking up 25% of that one pose. And if I move that locator into the area that overlaps between those 2 circles, I would pick up a little bit of each, and the RBF functions would then blend the 2 together. So you can totally see this in 2D. Let's look at it in 3D, because it's really not so different. This will also give you a little bit of a demonstration of the PSD tool I wrote around all the nodes that were created for this system. So this would just be a blend shape. That's what a blend shape would do, which is really, just vertex displacement. So here I create my PSD node. We can now got a deformer in the history. I need to add some drivers. This part will be actually 2D, so I'm just going to add the X and Z channels as drivers. And now you'll see the mesh lights up pink to show the historical relationship there. And if I change those XZ, those XZ values, I'm basically defining now a pose in space. So this pose exists at whatever those XYZ values of the locator are. This is a very basic example, but I feel like it demonstrates the concept fairly well. So as you can see, as those values meet the requirements of the pose I set them at, we get the pose. But if I move away from those or walk outside of that pose space, I start dialing off that pose contribution. And I can move closer to the pose here and then change the width, which would be the purple ring in the previous slide. This will basically define how big, how important this pose is, how much it kind of dominates the pose space. So there's lots of parameters here to noodle with and play with. Getting them to behave all correctly sometimes can be a little bit of a challenge. So now I just blasted through doing the same thing, and you can basically see as I move around, I pick up some poses. And we have a little debug UI manipulator draw there that just shows the weighted values and what poses are dialing in. In this situation, it's very obvious, but you get into shoulder corrections, a lot of different things going on. Sometimes you're not exactly sure how much percentage of any one pose is being activated. So getting a more textual spit out of information is nice. And then we can chain these deformers, basically just stack another deformer on top of another deformer. So PSD can lead to PSD. This case, I'm just going to use a single driver. So this is a one-dimensional, the most simple, almost like a blend shape now. And I'll basically now add in a blend shape to raise these columns up. So if I had added this dimension into the first PSD node, just by raising up the Y value, I would exit the XZ value of my poses that made the cubes fatten up. And so sometimes you actually want to layer your deformers together to create certain effects. So that's possible as well. The big deal here is driver coverage. Drivers are basically our way of representing the field on which the poses play. If you don't have proper driver coverage, you can fall out of your pose space and get pops and visual glitches. So how best to do this? You could use a range of movement, basically find a ROM and figure out where are all the spaces that something can move. Maybe describe things as hemispherical sweeps or arcs. I'll just quickly go through this in the sake of time here. All of this runs in the engine the same way it does in Maya. It's what you see is what you get. So I can basically rig inside Maya with our pose space deformer nodes and know that when I build the character in the engine, it's going to behave the same way. This is really awesome. I'm not trying to bake down to joints or convert down to float channels to say, oh, this guy was driving at this time. It's a nice one-to-one continuity. And I'm going to skip ahead to this video just in the sake of time here. So this is just showing the tool going through on some armor stuff. Basically, I'm always storing the poses at which things are at so I can reapply them, go back to poses. I had to do a stacked hierarchy of deformation where I deform things based on clavicle first, then I go down to humerus, then clavicle plus humerus. So because of this stacked hierarchy, if I change a pose on the top level, I can screw up all the poses below that. So you need some sort of system that knows, hey, you edited a hierarchy above me, re-update all my world space matrices, get my poses back. So that's what I was doing there with that really, really ugly pose. So basically you can get back to your proper pose even if you're making sort of a ugly adjustment. I think, so I do that here. So if I did something not so cool, let's say I just pull up all this, do something odd and then set a pose, I need to basically reinstantiate all the other poses below it so that they go back to normal state. Or else you're just a dog chasing its tail constantly, which happened for a little while. What are the most important corrections to make? Any area that undergoes a high degree of rotation, especially twisting along the bone axis, you get that candy wrapper effect. If you're not doing some sort of roll bone correction, or even if you are, you might want to use it there. We focused on areas that were most visible to the camera. We didn't do any legs, knees, or hips. And I already talked about this additive correction deformation order. Here's just a little video on the neck. So the neck is also an important thing to not ignore. I think a lot of times we get kind of a little stick figure neck that kind of loses volume and just doesn't feel solid. So activating the muscles in the neck is an important thing to maintaining a more realistic and grounded look to your character, as well as the bulging of the fat throat or fat in the throat. That's also important. When you don't do that, it just looks like you're trying to suck up your throat. Not very natural. So how do we source all our shapes? Well, you could go with a muscle ROM, do a muscle simulation. That's a lot of work. There's a high cost entry. What we chose to do was just targeted muscle groups and sculpts. So basically went for the anatomical extreme of various core muscle movements. So this is pretty much the totality of our body sculpts. It's not a lot. Granted, these get split into left and rights, but it's really not a lot of sculpts because we're going for this targeted motion. So I'll quickly go through these. I won't read them all out in the sake of time, but we do a clavicle raised action, forward on the clavicle, backward, humerus down, forward, back, raised with humerus down, clavicle raised with humerus up, and then of course the elbows and bicep under regular flexion and flexion plus supination, which is turning your hand up. Pronation would be turning your hand down. Supination has a large effect on raising the bicep. There's more poses than we actually, than these few slides showed, but the slide with all of them, that's the totality of it. And then here's just a little video showing basically when PSDs are off versus on. So linear skinning, if you don't do any helper joints, an action like raising the clavicles, basically you compress the trapezius, which is the muscle actually lifting your clavicle, and you increase the volume in the pectoral muscles, which is not what you want. So you want to correct this. The pectoral should be thinning out as it's being stretched, and the trapezius should be compressing and getting larger when the clavicle raises. So linear skinning is actually doing the opposite thing that you want under this kind of action. Same thing with the deltoids. The deltoids will basically lose volume as they compress, and they'll gain volume. So lots of game characters, as arms go down, deltoids kind of get a little too fat and rounded when they should actually be thinning out. And then, of course, capturing the sharp elbow is important. So you can see without it, on a muscular character like this, it just feels a little gummy and not quite right. So yeah, getting that stuff working right is important. And putting it all together here.
Tell me what I want. Pain stops real simple. Why are there two beds in here?
My coworker said I should jokingly say that Kratos is our efforts to beat the bad deformations out of characters, and Baldur is representing bad deformation. Although his deformation is also good, I'm not saying that.
Struck a nerve, did I?
So, kick the ass of bad deformations.
Who are you hiding?
So yeah, if you played the game, that was a pretty awesome fight. So lessons learned, I need more time to find better driver sets. That's really the basis for everything you're gonna do. If you don't get good driver coverage, the field on which the poses play, you can go down a long road and then find out there's problem areas. I actually had to make a couple corrections on chest opens, and I literally brought the elbow out like a degree or two just to get back into pose space. No animator's been like, what the f did you, or sorry. No animator has been like, why'd you do that? It was a subtle fix, so yeah. Additionally, I would like to add normal maps to enhance the deformation. I think that would be a good thing to add in there. I talked kind of about this, facial animation it's a big task. It's advancing very quickly. Machine learning is starting to do a bunch of stuff. So relying on outside people that are specializing in this, I think, is a very good call. I kind of went down the rabbit hole because I like to understand everything, and for certain reasons, it benefited us, but it's a huge undertaking. And now that we're on new Maya, basically, parallel dependency graph and animation caching, we can start seeing some real speed increases on these rigs. I think still the rig part system is a very good thing to have, because anywhere you can gain speed is going to be a win. But we saw Kratos rig go from 20 frames per second in Maya 2015 to 135 frames per second, and that's without any tuning. Now, if we load the face rig in, we kind of ruin that, and I have a lot of work to do to speed up and optimize the face rig. But the performance gains you get in the current versions of Maya it's considerable. Here's some resources you can use. Post-based deformation was a white paper written. I always find it funny the math guys write all these papers, and if only they knew how everyone was going to use this stuff. Maybe he did. I don't want to speak for him. There's an RBF solver on the Autodesk marketplace that you can get if you want to play around. Facial action coding system. Go check it out. Michael Comet's homepage. And then the GDC talk I was mentioning that talks about the network nodes. And that's what I got for you guys today.